Good afternoon. We're going to get started with the special meeting of the Hemet City Council. Sarah, can I have a roll call?
Councilmember Brown?
Here.
Councilmember Krupa? Here. Councilmember Wright? Here. Mayor Pro Tem Meyer?
Here.
Mayor Persico?
Here. At this time, there's communication from the public. Is there anybody out there wishing to speak on a non-agenda item? Don't all rush the podium at once. Seeing none, we will move on. If it's okay with you, I'd like to go with item 2 first, the approval of the city's investment policy. Is that okay with you? Okay. All right. So item 2, we're going to touch on first to get this out of the way. The approval of the city's investment policy, Mr. City Attorney.
Thank you, Mayor. The City Council asked my office to review the existing city investment policy, determine whether there were any changes in the law that needed to be incorporated, as well as any other recommended changes. We went through the various bills that had impacted the investment of surplus funds law, compared existing and modified law to the existing policy, went through and read the California Debt Advisory Commission's best practices guide, and looked at a number of different other agencies' investment policies, and based on that provided a reorganization and some additional sections that we thought we should include in the investment policy. That was provided to the city manager, finance director, and your ad hoc investment group that had some questions and further comments. And this recommends this policy that you have in front of you is the product that is the result of that review effort. Materially, the largest change is to recommend the creation of an investment oversight committee that would consist of 5 members. The resolution that you have before you is my recommendation that it consist of the treasurer, 2 council members, the city manager, and the finance director. Also recommend that the city retain an investment advisor that could also help advise the committee. With that structure, the role of the investment advisory committee would be to work with the treasurer on long-term investment strategy as well as proposed investments that are coming up. The treasurer would still be delegated the authority to actually implement and make the trades, as is under your existing policy. I do recommend that you authorize us to do one additional step tonight. Your policy existing, and we carry this over, has a number of different cost to portfolio thresholds for certain types of investment that are either different than what's in state law, or there is no threshold under state law. And I think that can be a source of confusion. My recommendation is that you authorize me to set all of those limits consistent with what state law is currently. And then at such time as you constitute the investment oversight committee, the committee can go through that in detail with the treasurer and see if you want to set limits or things that are below the state maximum, if you will. For example, medium-term notes, you can have up to 30% of your portfolio. You might decide that that's adequate, or that you want less. You want to be more restrictive. What we have in the policy before you is a little bit of a mishmash. It'll work, but I think we're really striving for clarity, and since you're going to have an investment committee, probably best that committee work over those details. It's a relatively minor change that I can make. You can approve it tonight based on going to the state limits where there are some, and we can make that administratively, or we can bring it back to you if you'd like to see that. There are a number of other changes that we made simply based on recommendations in the Debt Advisory Committee, or that we saw in other policies, and all in all, we think that this will help provide a little more clarity and transparency to the city's investment policy. if you have any specific questions, I can go through those.
I have a question for you. Would there be a problem with us leaving our thresholds as they have been, and then they can come back with changes from that? Because it seems that the state's thresholds are quite liberal compared to maybe what we have done.
That is not a problem. We can do that. I would ask that you allow me to go through the attachment and make sure that everything that we put in the attachment is consistent with the policy levels that are in the actual policy that you have, and then you can go from there. That's a valid way to go to. You're welcome, I guess. Those are fun to read.
Or for the ad hoc committee?
Not questions for the ad hoc committee, just adding my appreciation to the work you did on this, Eric, and incorporating all the recommendations that Carly and I made into the plan to make it, quote, ours. But I think the idea of having the comparison of what is on the state rules and what Hemet has always had is something that we should, start there. Yeah. Because some of them, you just kind of, whoa, why would you do that? But others, it's like, oh, okay, well, maybe that is something that we need to consider in changing percentages and things like that.
Our policy uses a little different language than what's in the state law also. For example, one category is municipal bonds.
Right.
Municipal bonds is in the state law. It's all kinds of investment products of other local agencies. So if you read our policy strictly, we can only invest in bonds as opposed to certificates of participation or leaseback agreements and things like that. So the committee should look at that language change too. We didn't do that. That's why if you look at the table that's based on the debt advisory commissions, there's some inconsistency in language with what is in that section. And I did that intentionally not to create confusion, but because really thought that it would be good to come back to either the council or the oversight committee to kind of hash that out. At some point, you probably want to adjust the terms, but it's completely up to you if you want to set more restrictive thresholds or quality requirements in your own policy.
Another thing that we spoke about is looking at an investment advisor, like you had talked about, to work alongside with the treasurer and the committee. And we don't know because we haven't gotten into any details of that. But if at some point staff could look into that, talk to other cities, and even if you guys decided to RFQ that and bring back proposals to the city, if you come back and say it didn't pan out, then it doesn't pan out, right? But just to look at it so that we can have some consistency with the flow.
I will certainly work with the city manager and the treasurer and the finance director on that.
If we'll do it. Is it possible that if we could get someone as an investment advisor that would do it free? Because whoever they are, they can't do any investments for us. They cannot have any personal gain, or their company
Correct.
have any personal gain.
While I think that anything is possible, that is a highly
Yeah, I used to be
lucrative
one of them. We didn't do anything
skill,
for free.
and it's a licensed position. I would imagine that might be tremendously difficult to find somebody to do that for free.
Some of them, like attorneys, are obligated to do some
Pro bono
work. So if we could find somebody.
I won't say no. Maybe
Okay.
there is somebody out there. I'll certainly ask for that.
As long as it's not community service.
I think they lost their license by now if it was community service.
I do have two tiny little typos in the
You found them too.
in Exhibit A. Well, I don't know if I found the same ones, but on page 5, under Roman numeral 6, A5, investment controls, inaccurate. just
Yeah.
one word? That's the
Yeah,
problem
thank
with
you for
spell
that
check.
and catching that embarrassing typo. That's
You didn't know I'd
great.
get that deep into the weeds of reading this.
great.
And then on page 10, under Roman numeral 13A, the second sentence, you have may include in there twice. So just take one of them out.
Got
Good
it.
job, you found
Thank
the
you.
two I found.
Okay.
Wish I could say that. We'll make those changes in the final
Yeah.
version.
But I echo my colleagues' comments on it. I appreciate the work. The red line version is so easy to go through and see what's new, what's been suggested to be removed and modified. That really helps streamline our review of it. Good.
So what do we have to do now? So the motion is to have, direct Eric to bring back the comparison on the types of investments, have it side by side so that the investment committee, can we have, do this with the adjustments? Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, and approve tonight with those adjustments. And then come back at a later time with the investment committee to make the changes or recommend changes to the full council.
Okay.
And if that made sense, that was really good. And Carly would like to second that.
Did you get all that?
Did you get all that?
She moves to approve the investment policy.
Sarah knows.
Okay, so there's a motion.
Percentages from prior, and having Eric make the comparison, establishing the investment committee to look at the side-by-side comparison and then bring that recommendation on percentages and length of duration of investment back to the full council for approval.
And to look into investment
Yes.
advisors.
All right, before we vote, I just want to thank the committee for making the recommendation to have that committee to look at this to make it more transparent for the citizens of Hemet and their tax dollars. So thank you. All right, with that, so ready to vote?
And you go ahead with your vote. I just want to point out that it would be good if you would populate your investment policy committee today if you want that committee to get up and running.
We can do that next.
You can do that after, actually.
All right, so that passes. So with that, now there's an investment committee. Are there any volunteers?
Yeah, I'd kind of like to recommend that Carly and I stay on it. Don't swear under your breath.
You okay with that?
Yeah,
And-
yeah.
okay.
Not like an investment.
So there you have it, Carly and Linda.
Are we gonna do that?
So the committee is already the treasurer, city manager, finance director, the two of you. And
Then we'll find an outside person.
bring in an advisor.
Pro bono.
All right? All right, very good. Okay. Anything else on that one?
No,
All right.
that is it.
Okay, sir, thank you. Moving along, the work study for the preliminary fiscal year 2018-19 operating budget, finance director Rocha and city manager Parker.
You actually have two budgets, a budget A and a budget B. We passed out the budget A that you've been looking at home. Budget B is based on the recommendation of the Measure U committee, not to use any Measure U funds, so we put together a budget B, which is the one we passed out tonight. Lorena, could you just give them a summary of the changes? There's just a few pages that's changed between A and B.
Okay, so Budget A was just the general fund budget. So in Budget B, the only things that are going to change are the general fund departments. And just to give you a little bit of a summary of what I did with this budget document this year, I separated it not by divisions or by departments, but by fund. So all general fund departments are under the general fund tab. Special revenues are under its own tab. Enterprise funds, which is our water fund, and then our internal service funds. One of the things you guys had asked for in the past was to present the internal service charges differently. So if you turn to that last tab, internal service charges, what we have there is first the description of each of those funds, departments, internal service charges, however we want to call them. The second page of each of those is a summary that shows you the funding sources, what departments or what funds are paying for those services, and on the bottom the uses, what that particular internal service fund does for the other departments. So an example would be information technology, which is on page 259, starts on page 259. On page 260, it shows you the departments that contribute to it, and then below what we use that money for. So salaries, benefits, software maintenance, hardware, computer hardware, things like that. And it has the usual breakdown like I've given you in the past, but it summarizes it here so you know what we're using it for and who's paying, what departments are paying into those funds. So that's the biggest change. Two of the internal service funds that are not being charged directly to departments are the attorney fund and the OPEB, or the retiree medical. I did those as operating transfers, so you won't see them under each department's expenses. Instead, you'll see them in the back as a summary of operating transfers, so that it's just coming out of the fund in general, not the individual departments, to pay for those services. The changes, going back to the changes between A and B, in option A, we had asked that the city manager had recommended that we use a portion of fund balances from some internal service funds to help eliminate the structural deficit. Another portion of it was having the public safety increases paid for out of Measure U. That was $1.7 million. We also had vacancies within the general fund, $1 million, that at the city manager's discretion, we actually have more than $1 million in vacancies, but he has to have some, there's some positions that can't be eliminated or frozen for that long. So it has to be at his discretion that he can decide whether he freezes them or allows us to fill some of those positions. And that's general fund only. That does not include Measure U. In option B, we took the public safety increases back out of there, put them back into the general fund, so that increased our structural deficit by 1.7. We took additional funds that are in fund balances for the internal service charges, and we also we opted not to fund equipment replacement this year for general fund. That's $517,000. And we've also reduced our training budgets for all of the general fund departments by half. Eliminate equipment replacement for general fund, and that's just their contribution. That doesn't mean if they need a vehicle, if they have funds set aside already, they can purchase it, but this is their contribution for future replacements. Reducing the training budget for all general fund departments to half. And using the unfunding or not funding the vacancies to $1 million. So at the city manager's discretion, what he needs to fill, he will fill. What can wait, we will wait until the new year if we can afford it. And then the last piece of it is using fund balances from 3 internal service funds to close that deficit, and that's $1.5 million. Both options, leaves the 20% reserve untouched as long as 17-18 stays as we plan and it doesn't tap into that 20% reserve. We project that in 18-19, neither of the two plans will tap into the reserves either.
Council's pleasure. The inference was that we go page by page. Is that what you want to do?
Hey, questions?
Okay, questions. Let's do questions. Come back here. You be the answer person.
Whoever's ready, but I have one real quick question. You presented us with 2 budgets. My question to you as a professional, longtime city manager, which of these 2 do you recommend?
Thanks. Which one do I have 3 votes for? Based on, I spent 2.5 hours with 2 members of the Measure U committee, and they impressed upon me the history of it. I knew some of the history, but not all the history. The importance of it to the community, the pushback that we collectively would probably receive if it were tapped, and that if we were going to do it, we ought to wait a year or 2. Things can change in a year or 2, the revenue structure or whatever. We might be into marijuana, getting some revenue off of that. But let the Measure U seat establish itself, show some progress, particularly to the community about it. And so I'm going to recommend Measure B, Budget B. It's the one we passed out tonight.
And Mr. City Manager, since you haven't been here, we heard that 2 years ago too.
I'm sorry?
We heard the same thing from the Measure U committee 2 years ago. That if we waited a year, then it would be fine. That's what we were told last year. And then every year it changes. So I'm just making sure that is out here so everybody knows that.
Right. One of the differences.
I can say names if you guys want names of who told me that. Eric Gosh and Howard Rosenthal. And it was a phone call on the phone. And they asked us to wait. They asked us to wait a year. And we have waited over a year.
Sorry, never restricted the water. Measure U just had 1 year.
You would have to come to here, and you'll have your opportunity, Howard. Thank you.
I'm going to finish. I attended the Measure U committee meeting yesterday, and what I saw is a lot different than what the resolution says. And to be quite honest, the Measure U committee was to oversee the funds. And the Measure U committee was to make sure that they were spent on public safety and on nothing else. And what I saw yesterday, and I saw it more yesterday than I have in the past, is it has single-handedly divided our employees We have two classes of police officers now. We have those worthy of the Measure U money and those that are not. And that's the same with the fire department. And I heard terminology used, their officers and our officers. And that was not the intention of Measure U. That was not the intention to separate the officers that have been here, the officers that have taken cuts, the officers that have, through thick and thin, been here during the turmoil. And they're not worthy of having money from Measure U, and they are public safety officers. So they are recorded meetings. I'm sure that they can request them from the city clerk if there's any question of what I'm saying. But it's a shame to see, because talk about a morale problem. We have our public works department who hasn't had raises either. And we were able to do this. And we're just creating one morale issue after another by segregating and segregating. And that's not okay, and that's not being strong for our city. And that is not what I expected to hear out of the Measure U committee either.
Next questions. Because I know everybody has questions on these budget, but I want to thank you, Ellen, for making your recommendation on which one that you would prefer to see. So thank you. Sure.
My comment was, since I made the biggest stink last time, could I go first?
I'm sorry?
I said my reason for going first is that I made the biggest stink at the last budget meeting. But to start off, I have some thank yous that I'd like to hand out. And they go to you, Alan, and to Lorena, and to Chris for the hours you have spent with me, listening to my concerns and going through the budget. And thank you so much for the adjustment on some of the expenses. And also thank you for the sheet on the employee, so we can see where the charge out goes, and also for showing me where the $1 million can be saved, excuse me, on a hiring freeze that will not affect public safety. So on all of those issues, thank you. You spent a lot of time with me. I spent a lot of time with you. We have a lot of conversation about budgets, about processes in the city, ideas on how to go forward, things to look into to maybe change how we do business some of the time. And I thoroughly appreciate the fact that you did that. And I also thank you for the recommendation on Budget B. And since all of my questions on line by line have been answered, I'll let somebody else go next. But would ask that if I see something that I didn't ask before, if I could jump back in when everybody else is done. No.
We'll see.
That's the mayor's call. So I'll be really nice.
Russ, do you have any questions?
I'm still
Bonnie?
Can you tell me why, I'm looking at page 5 of this A, budget A. And could you tell me why we don't have plumbing, electrical, mechanical, building, plan check fees? Why we don't have that?
Under the revenues,
Yeah, in revenues.
we should do that.
Join the party.
Yeah. If you're looking at the, I don't, okay, so you're looking at the certain building revenues, right? Okay, I don't see it there. But a few years ago, essentially what we did was, instead of showing those as separate line items, we just zeroed them out, but all of that is collected under building permit fees. So we're still collecting all of those, they're just not shown separately.
Okay.
The other thing, well, I should have put these in order instead of writing them on the thing. property taxes being the same. I think it was 100,000, if I remember correctly. And, which was the same as last year. And I would think that would go up some. Is it the development, is it because the developments won't be finished? The new developments won't be finished? In that time that we can't?
When new development has not been completed, we can't collect property taxes. I think the reason that I kept them the same is I based it on some of the history. And if you look on the first page of the revenues, 15-16 came in a little bit lower than expected, so I was being conservative. I don't want to give you guys really high numbers and then have to come back at mid-year and cut them back because they're not realistic.
Yeah, what number is that? Because now I'm like...
I don't have the...
Page 3?
Should be the first page of the revenues.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So under account number 110-0110,
Right.
you look at 14-15 and 15-16, they're a lot lower than what we have estimated.
So I guess I was looking at the 1100-115.
Prior year taxes? Well, prior year taxes don't change too much, and primarily it's because those are just past due. Those are tax bills that people haven't paid. They're really a minimal part of our property tax increment. It's $100,000 for the year, where the secured settlement is $5.5 million. So it's very minimal. It's not something we can really count on. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't.
Okay. Boy, I should not have written it on. I should not have written my notes on my budget sheet. Just on the top of my head, I can remember there was the item taken out for the 20,000 for the Solutions for Change.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you that came in at under $6,000.
Oh, that's...
So,
And the reason we took it out is because it was really a one-time cost. It should not have stayed in there.
Right.
So because that's all being done in this year, there wasn't a need to have it in the 18-19 budget.
Okay, so just for a note, it did come in at under 6,000, so that was good. So, we'd love to talk about the city attorney. And it's so hard to see what's the total amount.
It's, let me get you the page number. Just a second. Page 314 of the
New one.
new one, because that's the one that has all the internal service charges.
310.
314.
Sorry, I'm having a rough day today. 314. I know I saw the figure. I think I saw the figure at one point. So last year we put a set amount of $1 million, and this year it's 11. It's
1.1. Mm-hmm.
So, I guess my question is, isn't there any way to stay at that $1 million,
That would be a question for Eric.
Mr. City Attorney?
We do pretty good at staying within our budget for the general services, the things under your retainer, some advisory services we provide to the police and pitches motions. Those are generally under $500,000 every year. The great unknown is the amount of code enforcement work, code cases, and litigation cases. Just this year, we spent $80,000 so far this year on advisory code services. In addition, we handled 28 code cases filed in court. It's about $215,000 for the two of those. You're almost at $300,000 for the code enforcement work for the city. We also handled 31 other litigation items for the city. The city is awash in litigation. As you know, we don't initiate these. These are things that the city has to be defended upon. We've traditionally handled all of that litigation for the city. Each year when it comes budget time, I do talk with the city manager, the finance director about other options. This year, I know that at the last meeting, we talked about a firm that the deputy city manager had found that apparently will do code cases on a contingency basis. And I say if they will, go for it. That'll save the city a lot of money. Also, with regard to litigation, I think that our rate on litigation work is very competitive. We do a good job. However, I have suggested over the years that the city look at joining something like a insurance risk pool, like the Joint Powers Insurance Agency. And I know that my discussions with the deputy city manager, certainly that is something that they will go and cost out for you this year when they do the overall organizational review. I can't say whether that will save money or not. You do lose some direction over your cases when you go to JPIA or an insurance pool. But if the cost saving is significant enough, you very well might want to consider that. And so when I look around and price our services and look at what we're doing to other firms and what they report in their budgets, both in-house and contract, we're pretty consistent with the general services that every city utilizes. It's the litigation and code aspects that were off the charts. Even if I were to include personnel and labor, the personnel and labor support work that we did only add up to $55,000 for this year. And for a city that has 8 labor groups and we did negotiations and we've had some challenging times, that's really a modest expense. It's really the $500,000 to $700,000 you spend every year in litigation that is difficult. I make no bones about it. Litigation is expensive. Even at what I think are our very competitive rates, which are capped at $225 an hour for all of our services in litigation, it's still expensive because of the volume and in some cases because of the potential liability confronted in some of the cases that we have. So to answer your question as to why we can't come in on budget, I can never anticipate how many times we're going to be in court, how often we're going to be sued, and how aggressive we have to be in those cases. And as you know, we always come to council and say, look, how do we posture this case? We're going to look to settle this, or we're going to go all the way to trial. And we make that on a case-by-case basis. Every case is different. If we could lower our litigation load, your expenses would drop precipitously.
Well, and I think I mentioned this last year, it's everybody's responsibility. It's the city's responsibility to make sure that we aren't in a position where we have overlooked something that would create a liability, whether it be something in the street, something in the park, whatever the case may be. Not picking on you, Chris. But just in general, whether it's HR and issues in that area. So I think we all need to take responsibility for trying to keep those costs down so that we don't have the litigation that we end up with so often. But thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, sure. On the code contingencies, do our current code cases, what constitutes them? I guess my basic question is how much of that is closing down illegal marijuana shops?
Probably half of the 28. The other 28 are serious code enforcement violations that staff hasn't been able to resolve through administrative citations or quite a lengthy period of workup to try to work with property owners or people in possession. So these 14 or so are pretty serious code cases. Some of them will be receiverships. Other ones are just ones we're trying to go in and abate the whole property ourselves. The other 14 are chasing the illegal dispensaries and grow operations in town.
Thank you.
Somebody else has some questions right now, that'd be great.
Rush, do you have anything?
Yes, thank you. I don't do shorthand, and I was trying to scribble notes as quickly as I could as you were walking down the differences between option A and option B. So what I captured was you're going to eliminate vehicle replacement
In option B, yes.
in option B. And these are funds that are set aside or allocated for future anticipated vehicle replacement needs.
So what happens is when a department buys a vehicle, we use straight line depreciation to split out the cost over the expected life of the vehicle. So 7 years is what we give most of our vehicles. So every year, that department has to contribute 1/7 of the cost of that vehicle to the equipment replacement fund, so that in 7 years, when that car dies, they have the funds to replace it. And that's what we're eliminating, is that contribution to equipment.
So that line item of those contributions is one of the
Yes,
tools
but it's
that you
only for
use.
1 year. It's a 1-year solution.
Okay. So if that vehicle happens to be coming up the following year, and that vehicle desperately needs to be replaced, but we haven't set aside the funds to do that, we can't replace that vehicle?
We can, if the department has money set aside in the equipment replacement fund. So that fund houses everybody's vehicles, not just general fund, all of them: water, streets, parks, fire, police, everybody. So if they've set money aside in prior years and they're at a point where they need to replace a vehicle because it's 3 years old and it was totaled in an accident, as long as they have money set aside, we don't set it aside specific to the vehicles. We just set it aside for replacement. So they can't add to their fleet, but they can replace an existing vehicle out of those funds.
Okay. And did you have a dollar estimate for what that represents?
$517,000.
517.
517.
And then you're cutting training budget by 1/2?
Training and education and conferences.
Non-post training and
Yes.
non-reimbursable training.
We excluded police because they're in a unique situation where they have post reimbursement. So we didn't do anything to the police training and education, only all other general fund departments.
Okay. And would part of that be travel and lodging associated with that
Yes.
training? And what does that come up to?
$87,000.
87?
Yes.
And then you said you're not funding $1 million worth of current vacant positions?
Correct.
Okay.
So that means in December, when my principal accountant retires, I will have to go to the city manager and see if we're able to replace that position, fill that vacancy.
Okay. And I'm not even sure that my notes make sense to me right now, because this is where I started falling behind. I wrote down using internal services. So
we have 3 funds that have built up some fund balance over the years. It's the retiree medical fund, the workers' comp fund, and the liability fund. They've built up some fund balance over the years. Costs have come in lower than expected at year end, and many years ago when I started working for the city, different city manager, and every city manager is different, and every finance director that I've worked under has been different, and they all have a different way of looking at them. Some of them would tell me at the end of the year, look at the allocations. If we were short, fund it. Take the additional out of the departments to fund it. If we were over, give it back to the departments. But about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that changed, and they said, don't do that, because some of these funds need to have a fund balance, like our liability fund. If we were to have several large cases, even though we have excess liability insurance, we're still liable for the first $250,000 of each of those cases. So it's wise to have a fund balance in there. But to close the gap, we would need to use at least a portion of it. And it's really the majority of the fund balance in each of those. It goes the same for retiree medical and workers' comp. If we were to have very high claims in workers' comp, an anomaly year where we're having to pay out a lot and it's in excess of what our insurance covers, then we would have to find the funding for it. And I did keep some in there because it's wise to keep some fund balance in there to cover unexpected costs, but we used a portion of them to eliminate the structural deficit.
Okay, and that represented how much?
About 1.5 million.
1.5. And looking at, in trying to prepare for tonight's meeting, I was looking at the last 3 budget-related PowerPoint presentations, and I was finding different numbers about what it is we're trying to make up. I saw 3.5, there was 3.1, and so what is our target that we're shooting at?
3.5.
3.5, and that's...
And the budget, we in finance call it a moving target because every time you turn around, something changes. Someone calls you and says, I forgot to add this and it's absolutely critical, I have to have it. Or, we found a line item that we left in there that was a one-time cost and we have to pull it out. Or we got a call from Aetna and they gave us final numbers on our retiree medical. That changed the numbers. So every day it changes. I can tell you I made changes this morning before I printed this. Every day, at some point, you have to just draw the line. We drew it at 3.5.
Okay. And was there something else that I didn't capture that you said that you're using to balance in option B?
I don't believe so. Chris, do you remember? I don't think so, right? No. That should have been it.
Sure, go ahead.
That's the great thing about this discussion. It always brings up something else. In the past 10 years or so, have there been years when we did not fund equipment replacement or any of these other funds?
We did it about 3 or 4 years in a row. We started in 2009, 2010. And what that did to some of the departments is that when their vehicles got to a point, when you don't fund it for 4 or 5 years, your vehicles get there and you run out of money to replace them, and then it has to come out of their operating. They have to find it in their operating budget. So yes, we have done it to eliminate the structural deficits. But again, one-time solution.
Right, agreed, except for where Hammond PD is concerned, and they're driving some really old cars, which I commend you for. Keep them on the road, which means Public Works has some really good mechanics keeping those things going. My other question is on retiree medical.
Mm-hmm.
Does using that fund balance or part of that fund balance, does that have any impact on the trust fund that we set up for retiree medical?
It won't this year because I already put those $200,000 into the budget. So I've already set that aside or accounted for it so that we can contribute. In future years, it will really depend on what kind of premiums we get.
Right, and how much we put in. Okay.
And Chris reminded me the last piece of that, and it's a very important piece, is There are some projects that have carried over the years that are maintenance projects for facilities, and we took $505,000 worth of projects. It's a total of 4 projects that we took out of the budget to help eliminate that structural deficit. If those items were to become an urgency, we'll have to find the funding for them.
And what were those, what was that regarding the,
Facilities maintenance.
okay.
So there are projects like painting our buildings that are, they have, their paint is very deteriorated, and it's not very aesthetic to look at, but it's to help protect the buildings. So there's things like that. There's things like cleaning out the air ducts, and for people like me who suffer from allergies, those things are really important.
Well, we'll clean out your air duct.
Electric panel inspections was also taken out, and then the recarpet of the city hall first floor.
Okay, and you said that was about $500,000.
Yes, 505,000.
Well, that comes up to 3.5, because math is not my strong suit, but I was adding up the numbers before that, and it was 3.1,
Yeah,
so we were a
that's
little
why.
short. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. In the process of doing this, and admittedly, this is relatively new for me sitting here looking at municipal budgets, but when I was a municipal employee and working on budgets, whenever we had issues to contend with, whether it was something like this, when it was looking like revenues weren't going to match up with expenditures, the process that I'm familiar with is that department heads were given a percentage, and they were directed to go back, sharpen their pencils, and see where they could trim out of their budgets with their direct input, because they know their operations better than anybody.
Right.
And so that's what I'm familiar with in approaching when the numbers don't match up. City managers that I worked for over the years always said, you go back to your departments, and that was the direction, whether it was 1%, 2%, 5%, whatever it was. And that way, in one sense, you have automatic buy-in. Nobody likes having to trim their budgets, because if you build an honest budget, it's what you think you need to get the job done and provide the level of service that your community expects. And to have to trim it is painful, but it's a realistic situation that you may have to face. So when you're looking at coming up with these option B fund balance proposals, was this the result of direct input from department heads or their operations perspective?
No. This is the difficulty we have here. Something between 74 and 80% of the total budget goes to police and fire. And so when you pass a Measure U and you want to make them stronger, you're not going to go back and say, give me a 10% cut out of the general fund or whatever. We need to take 2 positions out of police. And so the difficulty is coming up with $3.5 million out of 20% of the budget. And so you start cutting that 20%, which is about $6 million. Now you're having the rest of the staff. You've gone through, prior to my coming, prior to your coming, they've cut the staff. They've trimmed down from 270 odd positions to 217. They've done some contracting out. They've gotten bids, etc. They've withheld raises. They've withheld cost of living. And so, from my perspective, I would create even more of a morale problem if I went to Deanna and said, you're 20, you got to kick in $400,000 or whatever it's going to be. you might as well close down the service. So that's the real difficulty. We're so big on police and fire, and the community voted for the Measure U and stuff, that it's very difficult to go back. So we took a look at the budget itself and where we could manage the budget and still keep almost all our services intact.
Okay, thank you for that.